Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art and sometimes the mess of software that lasts. We speak with seasoned practitioners who have navigated technical debt, untangled legacy code, and helped teams build sustainable and resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, I'm joined by Taylor Otwell, founder and CEO of Laravel. Over the past 14 years, Taylor has led the design and evolution of one of the most widely used web frameworks in the world. We talk about balancing developer ergonomics with long-term maintainability, what he's learned from watching teams grow and struggle with Laravel over time, and how he's thinking about the future of the framework and the ecosystem. Taylor joins us from Little Rock, Arkansas in the United States. Taylor Otwell, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, I'm sort of a minimalist, so I think of like simple, easy to understand, and maybe most importantly, easy to change with confidence, I would say. I think so many times, if the software is not easy to change and you have confidence about the change, that's a very hard and uncomfortable position to be in.
What do you think contributes to making something? I mean, I'm assuming people might be listening. Well, does that mean testing? Like what sort of things is it testing, or is there other things that you think make software easy to say change?
I think some tests are definitely involved for sure. So, for my context, I build primarily Laravel applications, web development framework, very spiritually similar to Ruby on Rails in terms of like overall philosophy. A lot of web applications actually aren't that complicated, but I think that we as developers have a tendency to like to overcomplicate things sometimes, whether it's through just sort of like premature abstraction or creating sort of like complexity where maybe there doesn't need to be any complexity, And, there was a really great talk or maybe it was a book by someone named Christine Myers, I believe is her name, where she said that software should be more like Kenny from South Park instead of the Terminator. And, Kenny's like very disposable, obviously, because he kind of dies in each episode. That's sort of the
spoiler alert.
Yes. But I think the point was like we as developers sometimes tend to try to build these beautiful cathedrals of software, which I think is a noble ambition, right? Like I also want code to be like beautiful, and I think Rails and Ruby in particular shares that a lot, where there's a certain like whimsical, charming aspect to writing kind of fun, beautiful code that I think Laravel also shares, or at least I value as well. But we can sometimes tend to, as developers, to create like sort of like very complex cathedrals of complexity that aren't so easy to change, despite their complex beauty. And software should be a little bit more, simple and disposable and easy to change and easy to pivot to new business requirements or new ideas, much more like Kenny than a very complicated Terminator robot,
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thinking about, given that you have built and work on a framework, you're building web applications for it. Was that, maybe, I don't know a lot about the origin story of that, and we don't need to go too far into that path, but I'm just curious of what was your approach to creating Laravel, a kind of an extraction of something that you've been working on for a while. Like in the Rails ecosystem, it's very much okay, we built some stuff and we're going to occasionally we'll extract something out that we think it might be useful for other people. Was that kind of an approach, or were you, I really wish we had something similar to something like a Rails or other frameworks at the time in the PHP world to make my life as a PHP developer a little bit easier?
So it sort of started as the latter, where I knew PHP from using it in college, and I knew it was easy to write and easy to deploy, but there really wasn't anything like Rails, which was definitely the, most popular hot framework at the time when I first started writing Laravel. Very full-featured, batteries included with like a nice ORM and all of these cool things. And there was really nothing like that for PHP. The frameworks that existed at the time were a little bit more like, I would say, Java inspired compared to like Ruby inspired, and I wanted to build something more like Ruby on Rails. But I wasn't necessarily extracting ideas out of an existing app I already had. But it did become that way over time. So I created Laravel. It took me probably 7 or 8 months to write the first version of it. I put it out there. It was not like an overnight sensation, but it started getting users, pretty steadily. And eventually I was hired by a company to build things in Laravel really just 6 months after I released the framework. So it was very new at the time, and they were sort of taking taking a risk, honestly, even like building things on it at that time. And at that point, it did kind of become more of a situation where we were building real things and we were extracting things back into the framework, whether that was how the database migrations work or the queue system or things like that. Those were things that were extracted out of real world application building.
Out of curiosity, where is that time? Is that you released, I think, Laravel, was it 2011, give or take?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I started building it in the fall of 2010. I released it publicly in the summer of 2011. And then I was hired to build with it full time, basically around Christmas of 2011.
Was that a bit of a whirlwind year for you?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, and when I first released Laravel, like I think the first day on GitHub, it got 4 stars, and I was like actually thrilled that anyone would use it at all. And I didn't really set out with the goal of building a popular framework. If no one used it, that was actually totally fine. I was just building something for me to prototype ideas quickly, to have fun with, and the fact that anyone was using it, was cool to me.
Yeah, that's great. The out of curiosity, how much earlier had you been working with the PHP? You mentioned in college. So what time frame does that kind of put you?
Oh my God. I was so unqualified to write a PHP framework, in my opinion. So I had written one class project with it in college where we built, it was for a local like food bank. We built sort of like a little inventory system in PHP for them as part of like a senior project in college. We did like volunteer projects in the community, and that was the one we did. And my teammate on the project, it's crazy how these things like affect your life so drastically. My teammate on the project was like, well, we should use PHP because it's just like super easy and there's lots of information about it, and I've used it before. And I had never used PHP at that time, and I was like, okay, whatever, sure, that sounds good. I did learn I learned kind of the basics of PHP during that project. Never touched it again, actually, for a few years until I wanted to build side projects and sort of try to start my own business, and I was like, hey, that PHP thing, that was pretty easy. Maybe I'll use that. And really, if it had not been for that classmate even suggesting it, I would not, I would have probably never gotten involved in PHP or built Laravel or any of that. So it's pretty wild.
Are you still in touch with that person?
No, I'm not actually. I do remember his name. I don't know what he's up to these days. I don't remember his last name, only his first name.
Has any idea that you've gone on to build this framework?
I don't know. That'd be so. I'd love to. I'd love to just say thanks to him sometime. But
here's your little. I'll send you a reminder later to try to track him down and send him an email or something. Because I try to remind myself of like those little moments in time where someone just like introduced me something, and I remember thinking like, this brings up. For me, I think back to a lot of my early era programming, and like I love PHP. I worked with a lot of PHP before I found Ruby on Rails, and my fun story about why I learned Rails was because I was about to get a job working for a company called CD Baby to be a PHP developer, and Derek Sivers, the owner of CD Baby, was working on. He was going to hire his first full-time developer that wasn't him, and it was going to be me because he is here in Portland, Oregon, and then he got stuck in a snow blizzard and had a Ruby programming book and came back and said, change of plans. I'm going to start using this Ruby thing. So if you can pick up Ruby on Rails, I'll hire you in a few months. And I was like, oh, okay. So I started learning Ruby on Rails and never needed to take that job. My career completely changed at that point. So thank you, Derek. There's always these weird little things that like happen, but it was going to be like, hey, PHP, I think we're PHP 4 was at the time, or PHP 5 was like a new thing. So where did you start in the PHP land? What you remember what version was 00 a thing?
Yeah. So when I first started writing Laravel, I actually feel lucky. I came into PHP in very much, I would say the beginning of the modern era of PHP, which I would consider like PHP 5.3. So we had classes, we have objects. In 5.3, we also get namespaces, anonymous functions, a feature called late static binding, which was really helpful in building the ORM. It actually wouldn't have been possible to build kind of an active record style ORM before PHP 5.3. So the anonymous functions also allowed me to build things like a very Sinatra-inspired routing system where it's just like route get the path and then you pass it like a function. That also would not have been possible, prior to PHP 5.3. So I sort of walked in at a very opportune time that I think is sort of like a lucky moment in time and very was at the right place in the right time for building Laravel and to be able to take advantage of like all these new modern features. A lot of the legacy frameworks could not take advantage of because they needed to maintain either backwards compatibility or they couldn't force people to upgrade to PHP 5.3. And I was able to kind of start pretty greenfield and take advantage of this stuff. And so, yeah, it was a good moment in time. And I never really experienced PHP significantly before modern PHP.
Yeah, and I sometimes wonder, I'm like, how much did I miss out by having split off and going a different route at the time? But like, I loved PHP. It was back in the day. And so, but then I really loved Ruby on Rails. So anyways, we can, that's a whole nother topic for another day. So, but, I'm thinking about, back to your kind of like the earlier topic around maintainable software. And, when it comes to thinking about a framework, when you're making decisions for Laravel, what kind of developer are you optimizing for? Like, is it you, or is there this, do you have this, like these couple of like personas that you kind of like, okay, this needs to work for these few people?
It is to a large extent me. I would say it's not as much me as maybe DHH maintains Rails very much for himself. I think he's pretty honest about this, where it's like, I sort of optimize for the things that bring me the most joy. And that happens to apply to a lot of other developers that it also, appeals to. So I think there's a lot of that in Laravel as well. And I think that Laravel and Rails are similar in that way. I actually consider myself a pretty average programmer, to be honest. And I have average programmer problems, and it just so happens that there's lots of average programmers in the world that need to solve, pretty basic problems. They want to do it like quickly and efficiently and in a way that's easy to understand. And that appeals to a lot of people, which is why I think Laravel and Rails are both successful. But I do try to actually cater to different audiences too. And I think maybe the area this is most evident in Laravel compared to something like Ruby on Rails is on the front end, where in Laravel, we have a tool called Inertia.js that actually embraces React and Vue and Svelte and other like modern JavaScript frameworks on the front end, but pairs them with the Laravel backend in sort of one monolithic repository, and in a way where you can just return data from your controller, and that gets hydrated into a React component, for example. So you get to use server-side routing in your ORM, but you get to write React or Vue on the front end. I actually have never written much React, but I'm sort of optimizing for a pretty big segment of the community that I know it's like important for, and I'm willing to cater to that audience. So not everything in Laravel is like only what I would approve or only what I would do. I try to keep an open mind within reason. I can't make everyone happy, but we try to be aware of like, the trends and development and what developers want to do and what they want to do with Laravel, and try to accommodate that the best we can and make it productive.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com. Tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. That's interesting. I think about, your role as kind of like a curator, right? And
exactly, yes.
For example, like Oh My Z Shell, a project that I'm kind of have been heading up for a long time. People associate me as being the creator of it. I'm like, I feel like I'm actually more of a curator of like ideas, and it's like, so if you're maybe also a curator of sorts, when you've brought other people into the project, how did you think about sharing that curator role, like, and having similar? Are you making most of the decisions, or is there a team of people that are making decisions? Was there a hurdle to get to that point? Like, now I'm going to trust some other people are making kind of similar curation, aesthetic choices for the benefit of those persona developers, the average developer that you're kind of describing?
It's a good question. So the answer is I haven't done that. I'm still the only curator on when it comes to open source Laravel, the Laravel framework, I'm the only person that merges pull requests. I actually already did it this morning before we hopped on here. So every morning, the first thing I do is I have a bookmark that shows me all pull requests across the entire org. That's the framework, the docs, everything related to the open source stuff. I do that every morning, 5 days a week. And as long as I, merge or close 10 to 15 pull requests a day, like it stays totally manageable and sort of at a good point. When it comes to like our commercial products, because Laravel is a company now, we have commercial offerings. I don't necessarily curate every pull request. I don't read every pull request. I curate at a high level the features and like overall direction. But on the open source, I am the only curator. I would like to get to a point where other people could do this. I think we have people in the company now that share very similar tastes to me, and they actually could do it. Like let's imagine I have to take some emergency break from Laravel, and we need to keep the pull request maintained. I think there are people here that have been around long enough, they've been in the community long enough, they have the vibe like sort of instilled within them to know like this doesn't feel like Laravel or this does. And sometimes it's not very clear, right? I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this where it's like sometimes it depends on the day and what kind of mood you're in and like how you feel about that feature that day, if you're really on the fence about something. So it's not a science. There is a little bit of an art to it and an intuition to it. But we could do it. But as of now, I'm still the only person that merges things.
So I think a little bit about you having a company is a different model than, say, the Ruby on Rails framework. And was that a conscious decision at some point? You're like, okay, there's a movement happening, there's some momentum happening here, and these developers need some tools, so maybe we should just build those tools and have that be kind of first-class citizens in the community rather than being like a bunch of third-party services that might spin up. And those are definitely probably still spinning up as well. So how did you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much like that. So around late 2013, I was spending a lot of time like spinning up web servers, installing PHP, installing MySQL or Postgres or whatever. And I had written scripts to automate that. And so one day I was just like, I could kind of put a UI in front of these scripts, and we would have kind of a little server provisioning and VPS management platform for Laravel apps. And so I basically started, taking a crack at that. At night, I was staying up really late at that time, like 1, 2 a.m. Was super common, getting up at 7, going to work. I had much more energy back then. It seems like I was, in my late 20s back then. So, I built that again over a period of maybe 7 or 8 months and put it out there. I had no idea, again, if anyone was going to use it. And to a large extent, again, I didn't care particularly. I wasn't actually trying to make tons of money or be super successful in business. I was just really automating with the UI, something I was needing to do a lot. I thought I knew there were some people out there that also would probably use this. I didn't know how many, but pretty quickly after I launched it, actually, I had sort of exceeded my day job salary. And then I was sort of in a little bit of a pickle, really, because I was having to do customer support and maintain my own product that was actually paying me more than my real job, but I also had a real job. And sort of when do I just kind of try to make the leap and go full time on Laravel? My boss at the time basically nudged me out the door and said, you basically have your own company now. Like, this isn't sustainable. So the January 1st of 2015 was my first day totally full time on Laravel, where I woke up in the morning and pretty much did whatever I wanted on Laravel.
How long did it take before you started hiring people?
It was actually a few years. And I think that's one thing that I would do differently. I waited way too long to hire. And it kind of ties back in with what you asked about the curation thing, where I was very scared that someone would come in and sort of mess up like what I had created. And so I put off hiring. And I put it off way too long, because once I hired someone, I was like, oh, wow, I should have done this a very long time ago, because it was just so much better. So I think I hired my first employee in maybe 2016 or something. So it was a couple of years went by where it was just me.
Having gone through a scenario where it took me a couple of years before I started hiring people, I didn't set out to think I was going to ever hire people when I started my business, but that transition from being a solopreneur to running a business with employees and thinking about salaries and HR, other things that might come along with it, that takes time to build all those other things. Meanwhile, you got this framework going, and as you kind of fast forward a little bit, thinking around as the software project kind of became more used and widely used, and you're making decisions and you're thinking about new versions of Laravel, I'm assuming you've needed to do things like break backwards compatibility at some point. How do you think about meeting the needs of your users and helping kind of plan that out? So like when you do, what does it take for something to be like, okay, we are going to change course of Laravel going forward at this point?
Yeah. So to give you a little bit of the history, in the early days of Laravel, back in 2011 when I first released it, we were breaking things all the time. Most of the people using it didn't actually care that much because they're early adopters. They are willing to put up with it. We're sort of figuring it out together. I would say that Laravel's only gone through what I would consider a rewrite once, and it was around 2013 or 2014. So the framework had been out for 2 or 3 years, and we had sort of seen now the limitations, the problem areas with sort of the fundamental architecture of the thing. And we basically I rewrote the architecture, the core architecture of how the framework all fits together around that time. And that broke backwards compatibility, obviously. We tried to minimize that to a large extent, but it did break some. Since then, we have not, I would say, rewritten things. We have improved things, and sometimes we do break things. We settled into a yearly release cycle where every February we release a new major version, and that's the only time we break backwards compatibility and, of course, come out with an upgrade guide and all that. These days, I'm actually trying to do releases where I don't break anything. That's really my goal, and it's mainly because I'm so frustrated myself when other things break. Even PHP itself breaks backwards compatibility, every year or two, which is pretty wild for a language. So I'm trying to do releases now that don't break anything. That's my goal. And I would only break things now if it was just incredibly important and, we really needed to fix something.
What sort of relationship does the Laravel project have with the PHP project?
Not a ton, I would say. So the current state of PHP is really a loose group of volunteers. There is a PHP Foundation that is a fairly recent development in PHP that has raised money from companies, including Laravel, that use PHP to fund open source development of the language itself, whether it's new features or bug fixes or whatever. And most of the new features in the latest release of PHP are funded. The development time was funded through that foundation. We do have a relationship with the foundation. People run ideas like, hey, I'm thinking about writing this feature for PHP. What do y'all think? Or just ask for feedback. What do you think's missing in PHP? But, it's not like we work together every day. It's very, sporadic and as needed.
Yeah, I'm always kind of curious how maybe Laravel has much more of a dependency on PHP than vice versa, but I don't know what the lay of the land looks like in terms of how predominant Laravel is within the PHP ecosystem, because PHP has been such a big thing for such a big long amount of time. Are there other similar, I'm going to say air quoting for our audience, competitor frameworks out there that are also pretty well known that I might not be that familiar with?
Yeah, I think the PHP landscape today looks something probably like most greenfield general purpose web projects are in Laravel. There's another popular framework called Symfony. I would say that Laravel and Symfony are really the only two significant frameworks. Symfony was developed in France and is popular in Europe, I would say. It's maybe a little bit less popular in the United States. And then you have other silos that I really never interact with. WordPress would be the biggest example of this. And that is its own universe, where not for any particular reason, but we just don't tend to interact with WordPress developers and Laravel. They just don't really intersect because the systems are so different. The projects are so different. It's its own little world. And that could go for other things like Magento or Drupal or other big sort of CMS e-commerce type platforms where they sort of exist to themselves. They have their own conferences, their own communities and things like that.
How often do you get to, you work on your own Laravel apps built with Laravel for your own products and such. How often do you get exposed to other companies' Laravel projects and their apps?
Yeah, occasionally. So we see this mainly through partner agencies. So there's development agencies that build Laravel projects, probably just like there's agencies that build Rails projects. And we see code occasionally through those partners, just if they ask for feedback or they're trying to figure something out. We have Slack channels with a lot of these partners. So they may be trying to crack something on a client app and they want to just ask me directly even. I'm in the Slack channel. So I come across the code that way sometimes, but I don't really look through whole code bases, of other companies' Laravel apps usually.
Yeah, I was curious if you had much exposure to what sort of patterns of, say, red flags that you tend to notice when you look in, say, other teams or older Laravel apps that those teams might be struggling with.
I will say that the apps that seem to do the best in terms of long-term maintainability and sort of the ability to just understand the code over time are apps that just stick closest to the conventions of the framework. The apps where you have developers come in and they sort of try to implement some very special architecture that's maybe totally different than the typical conventions of the framework, that developer inevitably leaves the company at some point, right, to move on to a new job or whatever. And now you have this like very specialized version of a Laravel app that no one else that comes in is really familiar with or has ever worked on. Those apps tend to struggle in my experience and usually end up being rewritten or reworked, whatever. But the apps that stick closest to the conventions, and that's, people always ask me, how do I write Laravel apps? And I think this is just, we as developers, I think a lot of times look for like a silver bullet architecture that will just solve all of my development problems and make it easy to build software. And they think I have that, but I really don't. I build Laravel apps exactly how the documentation demonstrates writing Laravel apps. They're very, very straightforward and basic. And I think that apps that are built that way tend to do well.
Do you find that any of those projects might be, do you think it's like a lot of those times where it's just that scenario where there's like that one clever developer that builds their cathedral, as you said earlier? So yeah,
I think so.
For those listening that might be on a team right now, do you have advice on how to like spot if they might be that person?
I don't know. I think it's hard to say, and I actually hate to generalize software too much because there are problems out there that are just genuinely complex, and the software is going to be hard to write. That happens. Like even building, Laravel Cloud, our latest project, like the stuff, it's hard stuff, and some stuff's going to be complicated. But I think, like in general, if you find yourself reading the docs of something like Ruby on Rails or Laravel or any other framework, and you're like, no, I think I actually have a better way to do this, and you find yourself doing that often, let's say, like every feature you come across, you have some clever solution to that's like goes above and beyond what is just sort of the standard documented way. To me, that would be like a smell, to think like, I find myself thinking I'm more clever than the framework most of the time. Is that actually a bad sign?
I think there's like an interesting thing about, the thing that I appreciated about, for me at the time when I got introduced to Ruby on Rails, and I just gave a talk a couple weeks ago at RailsConf about this, and I was trying to go back and like, what was it, some of the things that just stood out to me. And I was like, how many decisions I was needing to make on projects prior to Rails that weren't really moving the needle on making me feel more productive, like I was actually shipping stuff for my clients or my customers or the company that I was getting paid to do the software from. And so it's like about like, if your interest is on the code just for the sake of code, you might be more of a framework type developer, or you're kind of, it's a different sort of thing. And like, are you geeking out about actually just being able to ship stuff and be able to like change code, and like those types of traits in software became way more apparent. Like, oh, this is what I truly love to do, is I want to get stuff out the door for people. I love talking with people in businesses about their projects and how can I help make that a reality. That's the thing that I'm excited about. Like not me spending like, ooh, I like the third version of this like library that I built, like that no one else is going to see except for me and a couple of other developers that might work on this project, or I'm air quoting, lucky enough to inherit this one day, and they're going to appreciate this. I don't know that I've ever reached out to one of those libraries that I've inherited and thank those people. So, but, as someone that created a framework, are you not somewhat a little bit in that camp?
No, yeah, I totally identify with that. Like, I like both, right? Like, I like shipping things out, but I would be lying if I said I didn't geek out about like getting some really like clean solution to a problem I had been wrestling with, and the code comes out just super elegant and it's great, So yeah, I geek out about both. I just think it's just like keeping it all in balance, and figuring out how to be pragmatic about it and eventually ship stuff. But I do geek out about the code too.
We'll be back with our interview with Taylor in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for listening to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify and help spread the word. Maybe even post something on social media. Say, hey, this episode with Taylor, fantastic. Really enjoyed that conversation. The best conversation. The only conversation you need to hear today. Listen to this one on maintainable.fm. All right, let's get back to our interview with Taylor Otwell. So that's an interesting thing. Like if you're listening and you're a developer that kind of falls in that somewhere in between camp and you want to ship stuff, but you also care about the tooling that you're using and wish that their tooling maybe could be a little bit more optimized the way your brain thinks about how to approach these software projects. Do you have any advice for them on how to balance that so that they're not misdirecting that in any way? Because like maybe there is another thing, another pattern one day that needs to rise up in the future of software development. We haven't settled all these problems, but not everybody, we can't afford everybody to be doing that in parallel.
It's tough. And I don't know if I have a great answer to it because so many times, and you're right, like there have been new patterns that emerge in the Laravel world and in probably most ecosystems that actually do end up being beneficial. And they weren't baked into the framework from the beginning. So it's like, only in hindsight sometimes is it easy to identify like, oh, this was worthwhile and this actually paid off or it didn't. But, I always think about DHH, I know he's a polarizing figure, but I remember one thing he said that really stuck with me. It's just like, pull up the code side by side. Like, let's just look at two approaches side by side in reality. And I think that so many times in development, when you're like debating approaches to things, you get sort of lost in like the discussion of it all and instead of just like pulling up, two windows and like, let's just look at like two different approaches and which one is easier to understand and reason about and which one do we think is going to pay off the most in the long term. And I think anytime I can like ground things in reality, which is like, it sounds easy, but like so many times developers don't. It's like Slack discussions and arguments about like how we should do things, and we're not just like pulling up the code and going through it. So always bringing back the discussion to like concrete reality and looking at the code, I think is 100% the best way to do things. Again, sometimes you may not actually be able to tell until a year or two down the road, and you're like, oh, this was either a great idea or a terrible idea, and it really sucks to maintain now. And I don't know how to fix that, but starting from just comparing code in reality is always kind of where I try to bring things back to.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I was pulling some members of our team. We do a little bit of Laravel work at my company with some of our clients, and I've not done any Laravel work myself yet, but I probably should at some point. I know that they were talking about how Laravel gives developers some flexibility, like choosing between facades and dependency injection. So what have you seen work well for teams trying to keep their code bases maintainable?
Yeah. That's a very like interesting discussion in itself, just in Laravel's history. So like to kind of give the background, Laravel is really built around a dependency injection container at the core, where all the dependencies, like all the database stuff is in the container, the queue stuff. And like when you need something, you can type in it in the constructor of a class. And if it's a controller or a queue job or an event listener, the container will just inject what you need. So if you type in like a database connection, you'll just get one in the constructor. And that's like really the foundational like nucleus of the entire framework. Since that can become a little bit cumbersome, I guess, you can also use what we call facades, where you can just say like database : query. And behind the scenes, that will just sort of resolve things out of the dependency injection container using like the service locator pattern, basically. And that way you don't actually have to type in anything in the constructor. You're just in a controller method. You can just do database : query. Boom, I run a query. I didn't have to like inject anything or do anything like that. Anyway, so that's sort of the background context. And the history of like over the last 15 years of maintaining Laravel has been very interesting to watch, where trends like rise and fall. And I would say they're very influenced by like, for example, there was a period of time where everything felt like it was very influenced by like Uncle Bob style thinking of like dependency injection everywhere. We're going to like abstract everything, mock things in our tests, test things a certain way. And it felt like that like had a chokehold on PHP for a period of years. And what's been interesting for me now, though, in current times, and also kind of watching how people are now like vibe coding apps and how JavaScript development's being done, I feel like that is just like gone. And no one thinks about dependency injection in their like vibe coded app. No one's even knows what that is really. So it's been very interesting to watch. And I think like the Laravel apps I see written today, most people don't approach it with like that dependency injection mindset, especially if they're new to Laravel. They're just using facades. They're kind of taking like this very, I don't know what the right word is, but like they're not thinking about the architecture as much, like in that way. They're just writing controller methods and returning data and using service location. They're not always thinking about, the 5 solid principles as dictated by Uncle Bob Martin,
or who is Uncle Bob Martin? And they might not even know who that is, right?
Yeah, totally. Probably not actually.
It's funny. I remember there was this point when we were hiring people like coming out of like coding boot camps or something, and maybe they learned Ruby on Rails for 6 months or a year or whatever. And I remember having conversations with developers, and someone would mention like DHH or something, and there would be like who's that? You know, and like you just spent like a year learning this thing, and like, oh, and I'm like, that actually doesn't even matter, you know? And I'm like,
right.
That's so fascinating. And then, so are there like patterns that you pulled into the Laravel ecosystem that were inspired by other, you mentioned like Solid, for example, but like things like that you were like, who were some of the people that you were looking up to at the time?
As far as other programmers, Laravel was very Rails inspired. So obviously DHH. I mean, I think there were lots of other, not necessarily programmers, but other frameworks I looked at, like Sinatra, Django and Python, even like a lot of the work I was doing when I first graduated from college was in .NET and COBOL. And so some aspects of Laravel were inspired by ASP.NET, MVC, which has a Razor view engine, and like I named our view engine Blade. It was just like directly inspired by ASP.NET. So Laravel pulled from a lot of different sources. I think one of the most, inspirational books to me when I first started creating Laravel was actually Getting Real by 37 Signals, where it was this very pragmatic book on writing software with this very like user focus. And I thought about that a lot when building Laravel. And one of the things I think they say in that book is basically build the front end first. And you might not really think, on the surface that applies to building a web framework, but I actually took that to heart. And so like every feature I would build for Laravel, I would start with just pseudocode in my editor of like, what's the API going to be that I want to end up with? Because that is kind of like the front end of the framework, you might say, the way the touch point that people interact with. So even today, for all new features of Laravel, that is kind of where I start, is just sort of like, okay, what's like the dream syntax I want to land on at the end of this? I don't start at like, the depths of the internal workings of it all, which I think has still been a super beneficial way of working for me. Or even writing the documentation first has been something that I've done. It helps uncover a lot of like edge cases and awkward things. If it's like really awkward to explain in the docs, like that's, ringing bells in my head that the API is not quite right or something's off, that I need to go fix.
I appreciate that you kind of talking through that. I think that's kind of an often overlooked aspect of like what makes really good like API tools, or just like in the Rails world, they've got our Ruby gems and stuff like that, like the gems that are easy to interact with. And I'm like, I feel like they really cared about how you were going to interact with it and how you were going to use it. And if that looks, I'm air quoting, simple or easy to use, I don't really care so much about how complicated it is behind the scenes necessarily. I'm going to trust that you put enough care into the end user perspective, and not me as a developer. And so to know that you're kind of thinking about that in the PHP world, do you find that when people are building and architecting their own apps, that they should spend more time thinking about like, hey, we got to build this client library that's going to interact with some third-party API. Like, what would we want that to look and feel like? Or if we're going to build some new tool like that?
I mean, I would always encourage people to start that way, and I think that it's sort of had this effect of permeating through the Laravel community as well. Like the style that Laravel is written in tends to influence what the packages look like. And I'm sure this is the case for Rails too, where, probably a lot of the best Ruby gems try to feel like they're just kind of like first party, and like it would be part of Rails, and they kind of really blend in that way. So yeah, I think that I see that in Laravel as well, where like, hopefully, if we're doing things well and we're like designing these nice APIs and kind of thinking with this very user focus, that package developers and other people that are building applications sort of rubs off on them. And I think it has to some extent, which I'm thankful for. And, so I think it's a good way to do things.
I saw a Tim Ferriss tweet like a day or two ago, and he said something like, it was talking about like thinking about how you're approaching projects or life, but it was a simple line of like, what would this look like if it were easy?
Yeah, I saw you retweet that.
Yeah. And I needed to hear that yesterday.
It reminded me of a Kent Beck quote, actually, where he was like, if you need to make a software change, make the change easy. And then he was like, in parentheses, this may be hard. Making it easy might be the hard part, and then make the change. Anyway, yeah, continue.
I love that. I'm thinking, Laravel's kind of convention over configuration approach doesn't always play well, I hear, with static analysis tools. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how you think about the trade-offs there?
Yeah, so it's been something that's developed in PHP over the last 15 years. So when I first wrote Laravel, there were not nearly as many type hinting features as there are today. So I wrote it with everything that was available at the time. But over time, PHP's type system and sort of static analysis capabilities have improved. And so we have been playing a little bit of catch up there, both internally and just in the ecosystem, building tools like PHP Stan, which can sort of analyze your PHP code and find errors. This is a static analysis tool. And then there's sort of a layer built on top of that called Lara Stan that tries to kind of add additional rules specifically for Laravel applications. I'm actually very interested in this space, and it's one of the areas we focused on maybe for the last year or two, is like really making Laravel good working with those kinds of tools, because Laravel was so dynamic, especially in the early years where we just really embraced the dynamic nature of PHP, which I actually really like. I like dynamic languages. I think it's fun. But again, and this maybe ties back into trying to accommodate other points of view, right? Like in a framework, there are lots of PHP developers, maybe even the majority of PHP developers, that lean more on like strongly typed applications, and we want to accommodate those use cases. I mean, it's just a really kind of the majority of PHP developers think that way, I think. So yeah, we've been focusing on that, and I would like to continue to improve that, honestly. And we're getting there. I think it's just an area that PHP is still actually maturing and evolving.
How do you think about the role of automated testing in Laravel apps?
Yeah, great question. So I love tests, and I think this is one area that I've evolved as well. In the early days of Laravel, I felt like our tests were super brittle, and we were testing at like the wrong level of abstraction, and everything felt very overmocked and things like that. So nowadays, when I write Laravel applications, I pretty much write a lot of tests, and I write them almost exclusively like at the controller level. I actually make a request to a controller. I assert that things happened either in the database or that certain queued jobs were dispatched or certain events were fired. And, that's it. And I don't tend to do a lot of mocking or stubbing unless it was like I needed to stub out like a call to Stripe or AWS or something like that, where I don't want to actually create a server on Laravel Cloud maybe for this test. I want to like fake that. But I write lots of tests. I think if you're testing at the right level, then you can change the code without having to change all of your tests at the same time. And I think that's where a lot of Laravel developers struggled historically. They were testing super low level, maybe like over mocking everything. Every time they would update their controller, for example, they needed to make basically the exact same changes in their test. And to me, that's like a little bit of a code smell, where the point of the test is to be able to refactor the code and the test still pass without changing the test. A lot of times that's the goal of having automated tests to some extent. But now, what's really interesting part of Laravel history is Adam Wathan, the creator of Tailwind CSS, which went on to become, it feels like basically everything's styled that way nowadays. He created a video course called Testing Laravel, or Laravel Test-Driven Development. And it was like super instrumental actually in shaping the Laravel testing culture from that point on, where he actually, in the video course, he builds an entire ticket booking app and he tests it. And he tests it this way that I'm talking about, kind of more at like the feature test level. And the test just feels super valuable and robust, and they're not brittle at all. And that was actually a very light bulb moment, even for me, of like, oh man, this is like a much better way to test. And I think DHH, has recently tweeted he writes tests in a very similar way. So yeah, testing has changed a lot in Laravel's history. And I think that was a pivotal moment when Adam released that course, and it sort of defined maybe the modern way of doing Laravel testing to a large extent.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. If your team's feeling stretched, shipping features, fixing bugs, juggling technical debt, and there's just not enough time to get it all done, that's when teams bring in Planet Argon. We offer team augmentation for projects built with Ruby on Rails, Laravel, Vue, Next.js, just to name a few. Sometimes that means embedding one of our developers alongside your team. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 people. We ramp up quickly, work within your systems, and help your team make progress without the overhead of hiring full-time and making long-term commitments. Our goal isn't to take over, it's to help your team move forward without burning out. PlanetArgon.com. That's PlanetArgon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. Interesting. You mentioned earlier that Laravel's it tries to be very accommodating to a lot of different front end frameworks and such. And how does that kind of play into the testing strategy? Is that kind of then dependent more on whatever testing tools they're using in the React world versus the Vue world?
We haven't. So Laravel has released a browser testing thing called Laravel Dusk, where you can actually spin up a headless browser and interact with the front end and click on buttons. I'm not sure like how many people actually writing huge test suites like that. It can be a little bit slow to run, as you probably know. So we haven't actually dug in that much to like React testing or Vue testing. We sort of let people use whatever the popular tools of the time are for testing React or Vue. Lots of people use like Cypress or other front-end testing tools with their Laravel application front ends that are written in React or Vue. And then they'll write PHP automated tests for their backend code. That's a pretty common pattern, I would say. And we really haven't tried to write any libraries or do anything for testing like React or Vue.
Is there kind of having not played with Laravel enough myself at this point, when you generate a new Laravel app, what are the defaults for the front end?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you do like Laravel new my app today, you're presented with, do you want to use a starter kit or not? If you say yes, you're presented with, I think, 3 options. So there's a Livewire option, which is just PHP. PHP and Laravel, we have a package called Livewire that's very similar to LiveView and Elixir, where you're writing all PHP, just like you would write like ERB or something in Ruby, but it is like live updating. So like you can actually say, when this button is clicked, toggle this PHP variable, and Livewire like writes the JavaScript to like make it all feel live. It's kind of a cool thing. But let's say that's kind of the PHP stack. And then there's a React starter kit and a Vue starter kit. And those both use Inertia.js to tie the React and Vue to the Laravel backend. And you can use Inertia with Rails or Elixir or other frameworks as well. It's basically, I think of it as like a protocol to link React and Vue front ends to backends. And basically it's just like almost a JSON spec of like, we expect to receive a JSON payload that says what React component to load and what data to inject into it. And then we load that component, and any backend can write an adapter that just returns that JSON spec. And then you can use Inertia with that backend. So there's like a Ruby on Rails Inertia adapter as well.
Awesome. I'm going to have to budget some time in the near future and give that a go, just to give myself a memory of what it's like to work on a PHP project. It's been many years, but I always really appreciated how simple it was to deploy a PHP application. And I presumably still is. Are you still just leaning on mod PHP type approaches, or?
You can basically do it the same way, I would say it has not fundamentally changed since I started writing Laravel. We've tried to build products to like do auto scaling and auto queue management, to where like if your queue is getting backed up, we spin up more workers for you. But at the fundamental level, it actually pretty much still works the same, I would say.
So I have a couple of last questions for you here, but you've been maintaining Laravel for over 14 years now. What keeps it interesting for you?
That's a really good question, actually. I would say around 2023 or 2024, I started to feel like I was sort of out of ideas. And so let's say from 2010 up until that time, so for the first 13 or 14 years, there sort of just seemed to be a continual stream of like, I would solve one problem and then inevitably I'd be like, oh man, I wish I could do this with Laravel. And it just felt like this very natural progression of like one problem to the next. And that kept it interesting. And also just like attending the conferences, interacting with the community, hearing what they wanted to build or what they were doing. That was sort of energizing in itself, of like sort of just keeping it fun and interesting. But again, sort of the main thing was just like I kept encountering interesting things to solve. But around 2023 or 2024, I feel like I actually started to come into the office and be like, I don't know. I feel like we built everything I wanted to build. Like I don't really have anything obvious left. And the only ideas I did have were much more ambitious, and I didn't want to didn't want to fund their development out of pocket, which ultimately led to us raising, a Series A round with Excel. And I sort of look at that moment as the end of a certain chapter in Laravel's history, where it was really just me solving one problem to the next that I had myself. And, in the midst of that 14 years, I always wondered, like, how is this story going to end? Like, all things in tech eventually come to an end. All things come to an end in general. And I wanted to be able to, like, end things gracefully. I feel like a lot of times in tech, when people's time starts to sunset, sometimes they can get bitter, or like they can become like the grumpy old person on Twitter that like none of the new kids know how to do anything. And I didn't really want to be that guy. I wanted to just like, if it's my time to bow out, like, thank you for the time and I enjoyed it and like it was a pleasure, And so I feel like, anyway, in 2024, when we sort of raised money to build more ambitious projects, I was able to close a chapter on the Taylor Otwell bootstrapped one problem to the next, scratching my own itch chapter of Laravel. And now we started off on a new chapter, which kind of gave me a different set of challenges. And now it's more about building much more ambitious projects for complex applications and building a business. And it's like this whole new set of things, but I'm more of a facilitator, and it's less about scratching my own itch anymore. And it's about like enabling this team of now 70 people to build really cool stuff, which is a whole new challenge for me, and being more of being an actual like CEO and like enabling people to ship other people besides me, without my input, is a new challenge that I'm actually finding interesting and is different. And of course, I still maintain Laravel on the open source level, like I said, but as far as what is like keeping it interesting and challenging is like, can I be successful now at enabling a big team to ship? I was successful already at like bootstrapping something and shipping myself, but can I be successful at this? Is like presented. I've like been able to find inspiration in that. And I think that's what's keeping it interesting now.
That's great to hear. And it reminds me, I've known a lot of people that have made a transition from being like really, really small, couple people, to all of a sudden like 100 people, and being like jumping into the deep end and feeling like, all right, well, felt really competent at this thing. And now you're kind of jumping into a different thing. You're like, I have a lot of confidence in myself. I presume, Taylor, that you have some confidence in yourself and your ability to do things, but you're jumping in a deep end, or you've recently jumped into the deep end in something, and you're going to have to be figuring out a bunch of shit that you've never encountered before. And that brings up a lot of new interesting challenges, and that can be interesting, and it's a different mode of thinking and approaching things. So I'm kind of curious to kind of watch that transpire the next few years. So I'm not worried. I reached out to someone, Matt Stauffer, do you have any questions? He's like, ask Taylor, do you ever worry about getting bored? And I don't know that you have the luxury of getting bored anymore now. So I don't think that question quite actually works here, but maybe, or do you have an answer to that question?
I don't necessarily worry about getting bored in this, since I might have used to back when it was like just me. But I think like the main worries I have are being able to, can I actually succeed at being like, I've never been, I would say, a real CEO before, right? Can I succeed at that in a, let's say, a real way at a real company? And maybe or maybe not. But, I think like the challenge for me right now is Laravel has always been very closely tied or intertwined to Taylor Otwell historically. And it's been like, they're almost synonymous. And I think that I want to continue to contribute to Laravel in a very meaningful way for a long time. But eventually there may come a day where like I can't, or I don't want to anymore. And let's say 10 or 15 years down the road, when I want to retire and play with grandkids or whatever, someone else will have to carry this on, and I want to be able to build a business and build a culture and a company that can do that in a way that feels true to like how Laravel started and what our philosophy has always been, and that will feel like a success, for me.
That's awesome. I wish you the best with that. And I'll definitely be keeping tabs on this. And all right, couple of last questions. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
Yeah. Elements of Style, I would say. I think it's by like Strunk. It's a very classic, like sort of like English or grammar a style book. It's more like a booklet. So that, in the sense of like being very clear, writing concise, getting your point across without a lot of like flowery abstraction, I think was very inspiring for Laravel's own, like very terse, direct clear API. So that's a book that I think inspired me a lot as far as like API design. That is not a technical book at all. It's just a style book.
It's not a big book. It is kind of like if I recall, it actually really it was that wide of a book, right? It was kind of
it's like 60 pages or something.
It's a good book. I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for everybody. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
Oh gosh. So I post on x.com/Taylor Otwell. I think I'm also on Blue Sky under the same name, Taylor Otwell. If you just want to keep up online, we have a changelog at laravel.com/docs/changelog where you can keep up with all the open source stuff that we have done over the previous month. That's actually a relatively new thing that we've started doing. So that's a good way to keep up with the kind of what we're up to.
All right, Taylor. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.